welcome back to False Dichotomies. I'm Cy Castells.
I'm Daria Quinn.
Today we're talking about the 2001 album Toxicity by System of a Down.
Yay!
As I was telling you earlier, this was the first album I ever bought. Let's see, in 2001 I would have been 13. Kind of a late bloomer when it came to discovering music for myself rather than just listening to my parents' music or my brother's music. So, and then a used record shop opened a couple blocks away, and I went in, and I don't even know why I picked it up, because I wasn't, at the time I did not think I was into metal, but I recognized Toxicity as the name of a song that was on the radio that I didn't hate. And I don't know, I think that I'm very drawn to familiarity, so just the fact that it was I could recognize it was okay, and it was on the used bin, so I was may as well. And it turned out System of a Down became my favorite band, or one of my favorite bands, for many years. So how about you?
Okay, so in the late 90s, during what we will jokingly refer to as the TRL Wars, Total Request Live was a thing on MTV in the late 90s, and it was, you called in MTV and you requested a video, and they would play the top 10 requests, and it was sort of a cultural phenomenon.
Really?
Well, enough that, it basically launched the careers of several boy bands. It helped launch Blink-182 into the mainstream. And it also brought attention to the likes of Limp Bizkit and Korn.
So, the new metal phenomenon.
Yeah. There were basically two definitive sides of the TRL audience, which was the boy band teeny bopper Britney Spears clique, and then Team Angry White Boy, Korn and Limp Bizkit and Papa Roach. I mean, it really came down to, and I feel this is how well adjusted you were to the world, I guess.
You're right. Yeah, if you thought the world was a happy place and you were glad to be alive, then you went for that, the pop boy bands and stuff like that. But if you had this deep-seated anxiety that there was something deeply wrong with the world and or deeply wrong with yourself, i.e. if you're trans or queer or come from an abusive family, or you're bullied, or you're poor, or did I say poor? Or disabled, or otherwise a member of a group that is systematically fucked over by society, then you might gravitate toward the music that's about how awful and fucked up the system is.
Or just life in general.
Yeah.
And this particular, the nu metal genre, especially in the late 90s when it was really starting to come to prominence, I feel kind of gets a bad rap because of Limp Bizkit. Because Limp Bizkit were basically a bunch of dude bro douchebags. Actually, no. Fred Durst was a dude bro douchebag and dragged the rest of the band down with him. And of course dragged down the entire nu metal genre. But there were good bands.
Yep, System of a Down being one of them.
System of a Down was one of them.
A bunch of the people I associate with nowadays are pretty down on nu metal as a general concept. And when I found out that, because here's another thing about me, I don't pay a whole lot of attention to genre. Like I said, I saw System of a Down in the metal rack, and I know that there's distinct differences between System of a Down and bands like them and what would classically be considered metal.
Yeah.
I also found Course of Empire in the same rack, in the same store.
Right.
I don't know how familiar you are with Course of Empire.
This is the first time I've heard the term.
I believe Wikipedia describes them as industrial, and they are very different from what you would call metal. But they were still lumped in with the metal
Right.
because they are hard and fast and their lyrics are very critical of society.
Yeah, for the same reason Nine Inch Nails ends up getting lumped into metal.
Yeah. In the same way that, like, folk rock ends up being lumped in with country. There's a lot of difference between what we think of as country and what we think of as folk rock, but there's enough similarities that if you don't know what the distinction is, you will listen to folk rock and think, yeah, this belongs with country.
There is an intersection with new metal and, or at least I should say, mid-2000s emo. They were both very angst-driven.
Yeah.
Emo tended to be geared towards more of the disaffected teenager, whereas new metal was geared again to the dude bro audience.
It's so weird though, because System of a Down is so like
not dude bro.
It's very intellectual. It's very spiritual, heavily critical of society in a way that was very ahead of its time. I mean, they're making points in this album that are very relevant to the political system we're living in right now. Just because, like, they saw the trend in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it has only gotten worse since then.
In a way, I feel that System of a Down is a spiritual successor to Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah, I buy that.
I cannot confirm this offhand right now, but I do believe that Tom Morello, the guitarist of Rage Against the Machine, has basically endorsed them as such.
Yeah.
I know that Serge I can't say his last name. Tankian.
Now, I'm not 100% sure on that either.
We're sorry, Serge, if we're getting your name wrong. Please don't hate us. But Serge and Tom Morello did a lot of activist work, especially leading into the Iraq War. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about, I think, last week, about the Overton window in America being so skewed to the right that our left is right. These bands were people, and there are a lot of people even then that were looking at this like everything we believe is skewed so far to the right that you've completely lost touch. Late stage capitalism was happening 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, you've probably even before that, but basically when the baby boom generation took over.
Yeah, I think actually if you go back even further, Noam Chomsky was like making a lot of really important points just from the like pervasive corporate control of media and culture itself. And he was making those points in like the 80s and even earlier than that. We talk about like separation of church and state, but like right now the much more visceral threat to society is probably the intertwining of the state with corporations.
Yeah.
There's stuff in there about that in this album, and it kicks off right in the very beginning with the prison song, which is all about that, like
industrialized the
prison industrial complex, and I really love this song for so many different reasons. But like it starts out with this like really loud, really sudden, and then it's a pause, and then it goes like back into, and it's like
trying to build a prison.
It startles you. It's like, it feels like if that first note was not like standing alone, it wouldn't be nearly as startling if it was just as it is like, and then quiet, and then it starts up again, and it's like, it's literally a wake-up call.
Right.
It's like, this is to shake you out of your complacency and look at all of these things that are going on right under your nose. And it says and repeats, all research on successful drug policy shows that treatment should be increased and law enforcement decreased while abolishing mandatory minimum sentencing. You keep that in your head, right? And it repeats it as if to say, remember this. Remember this. So whenever people tell you that we need to get drugs off our street by arresting all of the drug users and drug dealers and putting them in prison for 20 years or more, instead of like treating them for their addictions and taking care of the social problems that are driving them toward drugs, you're being lied to.
Right.
Because all the research says that is not going to work.
Yeah.
And that just underlies the whole thing. It's remember what's being done here.
Minor drug offenders fill your prisons. You don't even flench. All our taxes paying for your wars against the new non-rich.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's a war on class, it's a war on race, it's a war on gender.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because it says, I buy my crack, I smack my bitch. And it's like tying drug use and prostitution, or at least the objectification of women, into like the same thing, because it's like how many sex workers out there are being coerced into it by like getting hooked on drugs.
Yeah, there's many there are many reasons why sex work needs to be decriminalized, and one of them is that every major problem with the safety of sex workers comes down to the fact that they cannot go to authorities for help.
Yeah, and like if you're a sex worker who's being exploited, and you're also on drugs, and that's part of how you're being exploited, that's a double whammy. You can't go to the cops for that. If you don't get caught, if you don't get slammed with the prostitution charge, you'll get it for the drug charge.
My point that I think I want to make has a lot to do with the fact that there is a new generation of sex worker who is basically working online for themselves.
Yeah, and that's
taking the pimp out of the equation. Yeah, which is, I feel, is empowering and better for, I don't personally believe that the porn industry needs to be destroyed. I feel that it and sex work in general needs to be reformed. But it starts by people taking the power for themselves. Yeah. And through the internet in particular, there are people who are able to make a living as sex workers on their own.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that it's very often a important lifeline for trans women, especially trans women of color, who may not be able to get any employment elsewhere because of discrimination or because they don't have the correct documents. Yeah. If you're, for instance, an undocumented trans woman of color, you can't get a job except in these unregulated markets where no one's going to check your ID or run a background check, and where, frankly, there's a lot of fetishists out there who'll pay a premium.
Oh, yeah.
And that's, like, really nasty. But however you feel about it, punishing the person who is, like, trying to take advantage of that in order to survive is not gonna solve your problems.
Yeah, you need to attack the root of the systemic problem. And we're not going to do that as long as we're punishing the sex workers for trying to make a living. Yep. It's not like there's this secret hidden meaning. That there's no death of the author here.
I think that if you are interested in learning more about mass incarceration and the failures of the war on drugs, check out The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, I believe is her name.
Yes.
So the next on the list is Needles.
Needles!
Which I really love. I have always loved this song, in part because, like, I have a filthy mind, and I just really love that the refrain is, pull the tapeworm out of your ass, pull the tapeworm out of your ass. So it's like, this is a song about, like, a tapeworm in your ass, and it's, like, draining you of your life and your vitality, and it's, like, and it's also, like, controlling you, because it says, I cannot grow till you eat the last of me. Oh, when will I be free? And you, a parasite, just find another host, just another fool to roast, 'cause you, my tapeworm, tells me what to do. There are so many things that could mean. And I'll tell you why I think that ties into the concept of, like, needles and therefore drug use. Right. Because you could interpret it as being, like, the tapeworm is addiction. Draining you of your power, and it's draining you of your energy, and it's just, like, controlling you. But remember that most people don't get into drugs just on a whim. And if they do, it usually doesn't end up being a severe addiction unless there's something else going on in their life already draining them. It might be that they are being exploited in a job that works them every hour they have to spare and doesn't give them enough to live on in return. Or it could be an abuser who is, like, manipulating them or using up all of their mental energy just dealing with that relationship. Or it could be like a government that is controlling its population in ways that deny humanity and individual rights and freedom, and doesn't give the opportunity for growth and self-actualization. So these people, in order to numb the pain of just living in this hollow existence, just turn to drugs. And that's why I'm sitting in my room with a needle in my hand, just waiting for the tomb of some old dying man. And I'm like, I think that old dying man is, like, at least as far as I can interpret, is a embodiment of that, like, system that is exploiting us, that just refuses to die.
Mm-hmm. I see the addiction allegory.
Yeah.
And, I mean, and for me it felt a little too obvious.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't seem like System of a Down to talk about an addict in sort of in a victim blaming sense of you need to do X and Y and you need to take control of your life. That doesn't sound like something System of Down would do. They would talk about the systemic reasons why you're addicted. So I came to the conclusion that the addiction allegory is valid and is probably part of it, but it may also be in reference to a toxic ideology. That the tapeworm, it's sort of like how the religious right tells you how to vote.
Yeah.
And with this, pulling the tapeworm out of your ass is something you can actively do to rid yourself of this toxic ideology, whereas it's not quite that simple for a drug addict.
Yeah, although I think that, like, there is significant evidence that if you address the root causes of addiction, then the addiction will be much easier to control.
Yeah. And that could be the tapeworm.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why prison as a means of controlling drug use is so ineffective, because you're not, like, addressing the environmental or the systemic causes of the drug use. You're making them worse.
Right.
So when that person gets out of jail, they are so much more likely to go straight back to their addictions. And then, because they've been, like, dry for so long in prison, they don't realize that their tolerance has gone back down, and they try to go back to the dose that they had been taking before, and then they are vastly more likely to overdose and die.
Yeah, mass incarceration and the fear of that is very potent. In fact, as we were recording this, a meme that has gotten very popular is some guy named Kyle apparently wants to organize as many of us as possible to storm Area 51 because they can't stop us all.
What? You're so close. Okay, scratch out Area 51 and write in the detention centers, and you'll have a much better plan.
Okay. In relation to this is something else I saw, which is the only thing that is stopping all of us from gathering around and going to these centers, these concentration camps or industrialized prisons or whatever, and dismantling them completely, is the fear that we would get arrested, incarcerated, lose our job, and become either life in prison or destitute.
Yeah,
that's the big thing that stops a lot of us from protesting and whatever else. I live on a fair amount of government assistance. And there was opportunities in the recent past where I could have participated in a protest against ICE. There was a group that was going to go up to the Youngstown Warren Airport, and a bunch of people were going to block a bus from a detention center. Oof. And I go to the meeting that is discussing ways in which we can protest ICE or stop ICE from taking our neighbors and whatnot. So I'm already probably on somebody's government watch list now.
Yeah, don't worry, we all are.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
they're watching all of us.
I feel like you aren't living a proper life unless you're on some government watch list. But anyway, I go to this meeting and I'm kind of like really gung-ho about it, and then the realization of, wait a minute, I'm on public assistance. Yeah. I'm on Medicaid. I'm on Medicare. I get disability. I could lose all of that.
Yeah.
And I can't afford to lose all of that. So I don't I don't participate in the protest. Instead, I go to a pro-choice rally in downtown Canton, and of course there's no real risk at all of going to a pro-choice rally in Canton because the government doesn't give a crap if I'm pro-choice or not.
Yeah,
well, the thing is I feel like the abortion issue is distraction. You know, it is an important thing that we need to fight for. You know, bodily autonomy is important, but I feel like it gets drudged up to distract us from other somewhat larger problems, such as concentration camps.
Yeah, plus I think especially right now, getting a bunch of people together and letting everybody know that they do not approve of forced pregnancy and that abortion should be readily, legally available everywhere, is very different from getting a bunch of people to block a bus transporting or going to transport detainees.
Right.
Because you can much more easily make a case in that second situation that these are people who are breaking the law. Like the first one is like that's free speech. No one's gonna want to stop you from that unless they want to give up their First Amendment badge of honor. But like if you're stopping a government vehicle from going where it needs to go, then that's what we call direct action.
Yes.
And it is much more effective, which means
the
government is much more likely to want to stop it from happening.
And there's always more risk involved in doing so. Which, and I don't want people to think that we should not fight for bodily autonomy. We can do both.
Yeah,
we should do both.
It's just like we're living in a really precarious situation right now.
Yes.
And part of that is like I have become more aware in the past few years. I am at risk of being imprisoned not just for my political actions and beliefs, but because of who I am right now. Because, like, okay, we've got undocumented immigrants being rounded up and put in concentration camps. And there was, as of this recording, it was very recently that Donald Trump implied that the next group to be rounded up and sent to camps might be homeless people. It feels to me only a matter of time before people with disabilities, trans people, any of these like groups of people that the majority of the population doesn't especially care about. And that's really frightening. So, yeah, I don't blame you or anyone else who is afraid of their livelihood or their life or their liberty being taken away.
Because the threat is very real.
Because even if it was just a matter of you lost your job, okay, or if you lost your benefits, okay, it's only a matter of time before you lose your home after that.
Right.
And then you're one of those homeless people that people want to like have rounded up and like dealt with. Yeah. Because you're somehow a drain on the society that actively prevented you from being a contributing member of society.
Right. And it's interesting that we went onto this tangent with needles because that leads us into Deer Dance.
Which is
a song about protesting.
And it's also about, like, I really loved the, one of the lines that gets repeated in this is pushing little children with their fully automatics. They like to push the weak around, and that's like... That meant one thing when it was originally written, when I was listening to it, like in the past few decades. But now, when we're thinking about little children, toddlers, infants being kept in prison camps without their parents, without the necessities of taking care of themselves or each other,
sleeping on tinfoil.
It just makes me want to cry. I'm like, God damn it.
Well. It's the song was apparently written specifically about the protests of the 2000 Democratic National Convention. That's why there's reference to the Staples Center. Yeah. But on a broader sense, it's police brutality in the face of peaceful protests. Almost any time a protest goes from peaceful to violent, it's almost always the cops.
Yeah.
Always the cops. And we can look at Ferguson, the riots in Ferguson. Why did the riots in Ferguson happen? Yeah. Because the cops came with tear gas and rubber bullets.
War staring you in the face, dressed in black, with a helmet. Fierce, trained and appropriate for the malcontents, for the disproportioned malcontents.
And, the thing is, the mainstream media is complicit in this kind of stuff, too, because they didn't report on the cops instigating the riot. They concentrated on the property damage and the looting. Military rules of engagement are stricter than police rules of engagement. If you raise a weapon to a non-combatant or you shoot a non-combatant, you can be put in a brig. You can face court-martial.
Yep.
That's considered murder.
Apparently, if you're...
It does not matter what that non-combatant is doing. That non-combatant could be cursing you out. But unless they're deadly force, you don't get to kill them.
If you're a police officer, you can apparently shoot to death an unarmed child and get rehired as a police officer within a few years.
Yeah.
And anyone who objects is like labeled a malcontent, I guess.
Well, these days they use the term SJW cuck, but...
Well, they're lightening up on the word cuck lately.
Well, that's good, because it's a stupid word. So, are we ready to move on to Jet Pilot?
I'm not sure. I'm never sure if I'm ready for Jet Pilot, because that song just...
I have no idea what to make of it. I went to the song meanings page where they list the lyrics and they have people who kind of chime in on what they think the song is. And I got so many different stories. I'm just like, nobody knows what this is about.
You know what? Maybe that's...
At all.
Maybe they're all correct.
That is possible.
So here are some of the lyrics. Wired were the eyes of a horse on a jet pilot, one that smiled when he flew over the bay. My horse is a shackled old man. His remorse was that he couldn't survey the skies right before they went gray. My horse and my remorse flying over a great bay. That is certainly a bunch of words you just sang.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, they are all words. They are in a vaguely sentence-shaped format. It doesn't track.
This is the type of poetry where really only the author knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, or else, like, they aren't meant to mean anything. Like, I remember, I think it was, wasn't it Octopus's Garden that someone said they made it just to make fun of the people who are always trying to figure out what the song means?
Yeah, that sounds like something Ringo Starr would do.
Yeah, because, like, okay, we've just had 3 songs that have very loaded political meanings. And then we go into this word salad. It's almost like another, like, smack in the face. Like, okay, you think you figured out that Prison Song is about the prison industrial complex and,
which
and
they
the war
made
on drugs.
Blatantly obvious.
You figured out that Needles has something to do with addiction and stuff. You figured out that Deer Dance has to do with, like, anti-war protesting and the militarization of police and all that. Okay, geniuses, see if you can figure this one out.
Well, congratulations. You have thoroughly stumped us.
Yeah, but, like, I think that's a good lead-in for the next song, though, which I think has a slightly more esoteric meaning. That it's like, if we think of Jet Pilot as reminding you that just because you figured one thing out doesn't mean you'll be able to figure anything else out. Surface level meanings aren't necessarily, like, what you need to be looking for. Then we go into X, which has a lot of interesting ideas that I am not convinced mean exactly what you might think they mean if you just look at them on their face. And this is a song that, until relatively recently, I basically took at face value. It's like, we don't need to multiply is clearly like overpopulation. Okay, we have too many people on the earth. But, and this is something that I didn't really look into until relatively recently with the rise of white supremacy in America in the past couple years. Overpopulation has historically been used as an excuse for white supremacy, and even genocide.
Yes.
Because we have this notion that, oh, the earth has limited resources and we have more than 7 billion people right now, and we can't possibly support any more people on the earth. And we notice that the poor people and the people of color and the people in third world nations and the uneducated people, they are reproducing out of control, and the people who are wealthy and white and educated, they have fewer babies because they know that they can't afford them, and they know that population is, and so we have this huge imbalance where, like, the quote good kind of people aren't reproducing as much as the quote bad kind of people, and then we have idiocracy, which is like
I'm glad you brought it up, because I was about to.
Because this is like left-wing people look at idiocracy and they're like, yeah, the dumb people need to stop reproducing as much, and then it's like,
and then you have to, like, Idiocracy is such a liberal movie.
Yeah.
It's not a leftist movie.
And I should have said liberal, but like
it's okay.
Not like most of the people.
Our Overton window is so far to the right.
Yeah,
that liberal is left here.
But like, and there was nothing like explicitly about like race or class. It was just like education, except that like education is disproportionately distributed to the wealthy and the whites and the upper class, and disproportionately denied to everybody else. And
I definitely feel that this is a song about genocide.
Yeah.
Possibly from the perspective of those who have been genocided. Because
it says, show your people how we died. And then it goes right into, we don't have to nullify.
You know, there's Holocaust denial. And pretty much every genocide, there's either apologists or denialists. Oh, that's not what happened, or that's not why it happened, or this is what really happened. And like, no, you committed genocide. You killed a bunch of people because you felt they were compromisable. Yeah. They were expendable.
In the United Nations definition of genocide includes preventing the target group from reproducing.
Yeah.
So, forced sterilization, putting someone on birth control without their knowledge or something like that. Or just, like, spreading misinformation to the effect that we can't be having children, you know? So it's like this, we don't need to multiply. We got too many people. We need to have fewer people reproducing. And since the people doing the most reproducing are the poor people and the people in third world countries, we need to focus all our efforts on those. And like Margaret Sanger, who is like, we were talking about pro-choice issues before, like Margaret Sanger is well known for revolutionizing like birth control access in the United States, but she's also known for being a eugenicist and like specifically wanting people of what she considered inferior genes to not reproduce.
As was Helen Keller. Helen Keller would have been one of the purged.
Yeah.
Or would in theory be one of the purged if eugenics were to be put in place.
And that, goes into like the construction of disability as a social construct. And it's like, yes, disabilities are real, but the concept of disability is socially constructed. Like, you and I both wear eyeglasses, right? But having to wear eyeglasses is not considered a disability, even though it's like we literally have less ability to see than is considered normal. So why is like needing to wear glasses not considered a disability, but needing, say, a hearing aid is? Where we draw the line for disability is arbitrary and socially constructed, just as sex and gender is.
Yeah.
Like, yes, clearly sex and gender are real things that have biological and psychological and behavioral like implications, but where we draw that line, like there's literally like for babies who are born with ambiguous genitalia. They literally have a measuring stick that they use,
Yep.
and they measure the clitoral phallus or whatever it is, and they say, well, if it falls below this line, we call it a girl, and if it's above this line, we call it a boy. It is an arbitrary line.
We measure babies' genitals. Just take a moment to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
We as a society allow our doctors to measure the size of a baby's genitals.
And then, if they don't fit a certain, framework of normal, very often the result is we have legally sanctioned involuntary surgery on those babies before they are old enough to understand what's going on or make any sort of choice in the matter.
And that's a form of eugenics as well.
Now, and that goes
it's
into...
basically erasing the concept of intersex, or at least attempting to.
And not only that, but a lot of intersex people are naturally infertile, but not always.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes these surgeries will take away whatever fertility you already have. And also, for people who are trans, there are lots of places, lots of countries where you cannot be legally recognized as your gender unless you have been sterilized.
Yeah.
Which is, again, it's eugenics, and it could be argued that it's genocide, because, you are saying, okay, the only way you're allowed to exist in this society is if you are unable to make more of you. You don't need to multiply. There's too many of you already.
Right.
It's bad enough we have any of you at all. The least you could do is just keep your genes to yourself.
And it's not just intergender or transgender. It also applies to homosexuals.
Yeah.
And this was common as late as the 1950s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wasn't it? Didn't Alan Turing have to make the choice between life in prison or sterilization?
Yeah, the guy that broke the Nazi code had to make that choice.
Yep.
A frickin' war hero. The guy that helped take down Hitler. That's the sort of thing we're dealing with. We also have, if your unborn child has Down syndrome, and they have Down syndrome, they give you the choice to abort the baby because of that.
Yeah. And even people who are otherwise pro-life will sometimes make that choice.
Yeah. And I am not against someone terminating their pregnancy for whatever reason they choose. But I do feel that someone that has said, I want this child, and then they find out the child has Down syndrome, and they're like, ew, no, get it out of me. And it's how it feels. It's that feels hypocritical to me.
Yeah, I can understand it being hard, because having a child with disabilities is always hard.
Yes.
But it's you never know how hard a particular child is going to be to raise.
Yeah. If you'd rather have your child be dead than disabled, that's a problem. Yeah. And that's a problem that extends to every disability, even to children with autism. That's the whole crux of the anti-vaxxer thing, is they would rather have dead children than autistic ones.
Yep, and we don't cotton to that around here.
No, we don't.
Well, I personally enjoy being alive at least some of the time.
I have a very low tolerance for anti-science.
People make the argument that you shouldn't bring a child into the world if it's going to be living a very hard life, and I can understand that from a compassionate standpoint. You don't want people to suffer, but you're always making an arbitrary choice of what suffering is worth going through and which is not, because I don't think anyone honestly believes that any amount of suffering of any kind is totally unacceptable. We know from a very early age that to an extent life is suffering. You can't keep that knowledge from yourself for very long. Buddha famously was raised by parents who wanted to shield him from all suffering of all kinds, and they kept him locked up in a palace where all of his pleasures and needs were taken care of. And even he eventually was like, I want to go for a walk. And then he went for a walk, and he saw an old man begging, and he saw a severely sick person, and then he saw a dead person, and then he was like, okay, my sheltered life with all pleasure and no pain is complete bullshit. I'm gonna go live an ascetic in the woods, you know? And, like, so we all acknowledge that it is not good to deny suffering. Because then when it does hit you, it's gonna be so much worse. So, like, but we've still had people, I've had people say to me, like, that gay people shouldn't have kids. Because their kids would be made fun of for having gay parents. It's like, really? That's like a reason to have that kid not even allowed to exist? It's like, you may as well say that, like, black people shouldn't have kids.
Right.
Because racism exists. Just by saying gay people shouldn't have kids, or any sort of minority shouldn't have kids, you're making it more likely that any kid in those families is gonna end up being more likely to be subject to persecution or harassment because you've established that their existence is abnormal.
The question comes down to how much of this suffering is something that would occur naturally because of someone's, like if you have Down syndrome, how much of the suffering would a person actually go through simply through having Down syndrome, and how much of that is the societal bias against them? You know, if we go by the example, you know, black folk and gay people and whatever else, that kind of suffering, it's almost always systemic structural bullshit, basically.
Yeah, and like we've touched on this in previous episodes with like trans people who are allowed to transition from a young age and who have like supportive families and schools and stuff, they have lower risk of mental illness and suicide, like almost exactly the same risk as the general population, because it turns out it's not being trans that causes bad mental health outcomes. It's the transphobia. It's the marginalization. It's not having a place in the world for yourself.
Okay, so we go to the big radio hit, Chop Suey.
We're rolling suicide. And if you hear that, like, little snippet in the very beginning, it's because the working title of this track was Suicide. And
the record company was like, nah, you need to chop this up.
So they called it
Chop Suey.
So this is a hell of a song. It's not often that with a band that's very intelligent and subtle and has a lot of like political meanings in it, that the most popular song is actually also very meaningful. And this is one of those.
Yeah.
I was not raised Christian. I was raised, as I mentioned, by two former Catholics, and I was raised in a Unitarian Universalist church. We don't really have like much in the way of specific like beliefs, just a bunch of like values and principles that we hold sacred. So when I was a kid and I was listening to this album and I came to the line, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Father, into your hands, why have you forsaken me?" I did not pick up on the religious reference there.
Right.
Because allegedly those were the words that Jesus said when he was being crucified.
Yeah.
And it's like a symbolic of, at least in like the story of Jesus and his crucifixion, this was the moment where even he lost all faith and all hope. And he felt completely alone and completely forsaken.
In the theology,
it
is believed that this is the moment when even God turned his back on Jesus.
And so, working back from that line, which comes at a very climactic part of the song, it's like we're talking about, "I cry when angels deserve to die," which is also the very last line. So it's like, okay, so we got angels dying, we have a reference to Jesus on the cross, and we have, "I don't think you trust in my self-righteous suicide." After, I think I, at some point, made the connection, oh, are we saying that Jesus's crucifixion was a self-righteous suicide? Because we have in some versions of the theology, God sent Jesus to earth to be crucified. Mm-hmm. Like, this was just part of the plan.
Yeah.
And Jesus is God, so it is basically a suicide. Mm-hmm. And it's like, describing Jesus as self-righteous is like a really scathing take. It's almost like a saying that, like, the strain of self-righteousness and, like, self-importance in organized religion goes all the way to the top, right all the way up to Jesus. Mm-hmm. That is leaving no room for, like, a version of Christianity that was pure and good and meaningful and then got co-opted by greedy humans. No, it was always like that from the very beginning. Right. At least that's, like, what I might be seeing in this.
The lead up into the I don't think you trust in my self-righteous suicide has, here you go, create another fable. You wanted to grab a brush and put a little makeup. You wanted to hide the scars of fat and fade away the shake-up. You wanted to. Why'd you leave the keys up on the table? You wanted to, which is a repeat of the previous few lines, but added to that, you wanted to. Mm-hmm. So I feel like this may be a song about self-imposed martyrdom.
Yeah.
The sort of mindset that creates a suicide bomber. Or
just like a parent who like whenever their child does something they don't approve of, they'll be like, they'll pull out all the things that they went through for you. They'll like talk about all the things they put up with from you, all the dirty diapers, all the hours in labor, all the money they spent on you, all the tantrums they put up with. They'll like and they'll pull this out like when their child is an adult and has like decided to move away or study art instead of law or something like that. But you wanted to.
Yeah.
You wanted to. You did this because you wanted to. You had a choice.
Yeah.
One of the great ironies of life that I really admire is the total cliche angsty teenager who is tired of being bossed around by their parents. They'll say, I didn't ask to be born. Yes, that is like totally a cliche angsty teenager thing to say, but it's also really fucking true. Yeah. Nobody asks to be born.
Oh, yeah.
Like, whenever you have a parent-child dynamic, even when the child is close to adulthood, every aspect of that dynamic is established by the parent.
Right. So we're self-righteous suicides. And
so after Chop Suey is Bounce. Bounce is the one with the pogo stick, which is totally a literal pogo stick and not figurative.
And not someone's dick, even though it's like, on a casual listen, you're just like, okay, you have all these things, you have songs about prison industrial complex and police brutality and suicide and all that, and then you come to the song like he's bouncing on a pogo stick. You know what this is? I'm okay with that. This is kind of cool because this is a band that can go from one extreme to the other and it doesn't sound weird.
Yeah.
And then you actually read the lyrics and I'm like, no, he's talking about sex.
But even that is still a change in tone because it's like sex in a very like hedonistic, degenerate, like we have this what are now called SJWs are generally considered like joyless people who want to like ruin everything that's beautiful and good. When really it's all about liberating us from the things that are keeping us from real pleasure, real joy, real indulgence, because like what tells us not to have rampant sex with lots and lots of people who are totally willing and consenting? It's the patriarchy, it's the religion, it's like the medical complex which spreads misinformation about STDs and stuff like that, and withholds like safe, reliable birth control.
And our sexual education, which completely overlooks the other ways that one can perform sexually that has absolutely nothing to do with genital penetration.
Yeah, or just the fact that like masturbation is healthy and normal and can be really good for you.
And it's something that both of you can do to one another.
Yes. It's called mutual masturbation. Look it up.
Well, there is the mutual where it's like each one is taking care of their own business. And, of course, then there's the you're taking care of each other's business.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah like It was so exotic. I really love that line. You have a pogo stick just to show her a trick. And she has so many friends.
But remember, there's just one pogo stick.
There's just one pogo stick.
So
it's doing a lot of work.
I feel that there are other things working at the same time, and there may be some of those friends that are just kind of there with each other.
Yeah, maybe.
Or there to watch, or... Mm-hmm. I find a band that can go from one extreme to another like this, and it doesn't sound weird or awkward or forced.
Yeah.
And System of a Down is really good at songs with energy.
Yeah, and I think they're also a band that like really plays with their emotions. Even their very intellectual stuff with like complex messages to make, they're always driven by like this beating heart. Mm-hmm. They live in their bodies in a way that really comes through. Mm-hmm. And it really comes through in Serj Tankian's voice, which also goes from one extreme to another in the blink of an eye, where it's like he will be growling and screeching, and then it'll go straight into this like really sweet melodic line, and it'll also be like making these really weird like goofy sounds and like comedic voices. When we were teenagers, one time I found out that my brother doesn't like System of a Down. Oh, and no. I was surprised. I said, well, why don't you like them? And he said, well, the lead singer can't sing. And I was like, what? What? I mean, I can understand if you don't like his style of singing.
Yeah.
But, like, to say that he can't sing? It's like he has such amazing skill and mastery of that voice. I think that to say that he can't sing is to, like, have a very, very narrow definition of singing that excludes some of the best vocal art out there.
And there is a snobbery when it comes to singing. The thing about vocals is I feel that if they fit the band and they don't annoy me at the hell when I listen to them, they're fine. And then there are examples I will point out, say Miley Cyrus. I think Miley Cyrus is in the wrong genre. I feel like she needs to be in a rock band.
Oh yeah, I could see that.
And not like, not like one of these cock rock bands either. We're talking like one of these like heavy, grungy.
I really like vocalists with very distinctive voices. And Serj Tankian is clearly one of them.
Yes, he is.
I can also think of like Amanda Palmer has a very distinctive voice, which, like Serj Tankian's, she can go straight from melodic to growling and like just frenetic and like so in just like from one line to the next and back again. Yeah, I think that anybody who can really like sing something in a way that is completely inimitable, like that, and that's another thing that before the recording era, being inimitable in your voice was not like good, at least in like the mainstream sense.
Right.
Choir music, like classical choir music, ideally is supposed to sound like one voice.
Right.
Because everybody is just so homogeneously meshed together that they come off as one very powerful voice rather than like 20 or 50 or 100 individual voices. Whereas with the advent of the recording era, we could have very distinctive voices be just as popular and more so than individual singers who could just like really faithfully reproduce a sound. Because you could have the faithful reproduction of the sound be done by the recording technology itself.
Right. And if you're going to say something silly, personal opinion, like Serj Tankian can't sing, you might as well be saying that about Tom Waits or Billy Corgan.
Or Elvis.
Or Elvis, even. It sounds like he's got like marbles in his mouth and the lip is permanently stuck up.
Yeah. Or Kurt Cobain.
Who didn't really sing or scream.
Yeah.
More than he was just... There was something there that wasn't one or the other. It was kind of both. Yeah, definitely speaking in agony.
Basically, the singers of the recording era who are most notable are the ones who are most distinctive.
Yeah.
because you got to stand out. And, like, I think that's good. We have a diversity of music now that we couldn't have had before.
Okay, so we go into Forest.
Well, that's another song that I think is very thematically similar to Chop Suey. Mm-hmm. Because it has all this imagery of, like, a parent-child dynamic. I always got the distinct impression when I was listening to this that the child in this story, in this song, is, like, some kind of messiah figure who has all of this expectation on them, like Jesus. Why can't you see that you are my child? Why don't you know that you are my mind? Tell everyone in the world that I'm you. And that's like, I got this distinct impression, and I don't know if it's like accurate or not, that this was God talking to Jesus or some messiah figure just being like, this is you. This is what you have to do. You have to tell everyone in the world, and like, you can't deny it. Just like this really insistent, like, compulsion.
I feel like for me it's kind of a darker turn because there is that dynamic of God talking to Jesus and saying this, this is what you need to do. But I also feel like that is the church telling the member what to do, especially in evangelical circles where the whole idea of proselytizing, I actually saw something really interesting about this recently, but it was the idea of proselytizing isn't really about gaining new members. It's about brainwashing and training current members to see the outside world as something other, and to latch on and become more dependent into their own tribe.
Yeah. I actually find, I think that my perspective as like a non-Christian who was raised non-Christian, but I've had like experiences with Christianity. I practiced Christianity for like 5 years in my early 20s. I can understand Christianity in this very kind of emotionally distant sense where it's like, I can either take or leave it.
Right.
And depending on my circumstances, sometimes I take it and sometimes I leave it. But whereas someone who was raised Christian can't look at it with that kind of like detachedness because they have like all of these like vital childhood memories associated with it, and they'll either embrace it fully and like they might question it, but they won't question it too hard, or they will like be so completely disillusioned with it that they can't see any value in it at all.
Right.
And whereas I can look at it and be like, yes, I can see the appeal of this religion, I can see the crimes of this religion, and I don't see it as absolutely different from any other major religion. It just happens to be the religion that is most powerful in this part of the world right now. So when I am proselytized to, I have like a very different reaction, because it's like I had an acquaintance of mine recently, like I believe he's a Mormon actually. We've talked a little bit about religion a few times, and most of the time I've been like, yeah, I don't believe that, but I'm cool with you believing it. Like it's not a big deal. And of course, like a Christian hearing that isn't like, especially if they're an evangelical kind of Christian, they're not going to take that lying down. They're going to be like, oh no, I got to keep working on you until you say that, and until you accept it. Like when we most recently met, he gave me a tract, and it said, and he held it out and it said, a love letter from Jesus. And he said, I wanted to give this to you. And I said, a love letter? And he said, oh, not from me. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, I could read that it said from Jesus, but thank you for clarifying. And then I was reading it later in the day, because like I do read it. That's the thing. I do read it. I've done that. I get some like dark satisfaction from reading it. It's like, it's never anything I don't already know. But it occurred to me, I actually wrote this down in my journal, so I'll pull it up. Okay, I wrote, imagine being approached by a stranger on the street who tells you that he has a message from your wife. And the message is, your wife loves you, and she's ready to forgive you as soon as you apologize. Now imagine that, yes, you do have a wife, but you were just talking to her, and you've had no significant marital problems, so you're inclined to think that this stranger is either a scam artist or has mistaken you for someone. And either way, you're not interested in talking to them.
Right.
But when you politely excuse yourself and try to get on with your day, he chases you down the street, demanding to know why you hate your wife and why you're so determined to turn away from her. That's evangelism. To someone who isn't like already in the circle.
Oh yeah. That's
it's like,
absolutely
it's like, I I have no complaints about my relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we're getting on just fine. I don't think I need some random stranger in the street telling me that I need to get right with God. And they say, oh, you're deeply suffering inside because of your distance from God. And I'm like, no, actually, that's not what's going on. You can say whatever you want about my soul, but can you see it?
There are a group of people who pass out tracts at First Friday every month. First Friday is a thing that happens in downtown Canton. It's supposed to be a gathering celebrating the arts district. It has become a reason for bars to jack up their prices and have special. It's basically become a bar crawl, or at least it's a bar crawl after 9 o'clock. There is this group. I think they're all from the same church, and they take up a corner and they pass out tracts, and there's one guy on a literal soapbox screaming at the top of his lungs about Jesus and salvation and turning, and this is the same guy that does so at the bus station every Saturday. And he spends an hour or two standing on a soapbox, and he will yell for 2 hours or so, whatever the message of Jesus is that day, and you need to turn in your salvation and whatever. And it's just like, if the point was to recruit, they're doing it in the worst way possible, which is why the theory that we brought up that was shown to us earlier was the idea that it's not about getting new souls, it's about affirming and confirming the tribe. And speaking of tribalism, we come to Atwa.
Yeah, and that's a song that's very
loaded. The Atwa is I don't think acronym is the proper term because acronym usually has to be a name. The initialism stands for Air, Trees, Water, and Animals. Is a reference to Charles Manson and his extreme environmentalist views. Quoted from Darren Malkian. I believe he's the guitarist. He claims that Charles Manson is in jail for the wrong reasons. He thinks he had an unfair trial. And there is actually an environmental group which is a direct offset of Manson's ideology. And the website, they have a website called Atwa Earth. That's ATWA Earth.com. It claims to have roots in Kentucky, where people on the land took a stand against industrial progress in the 1930s, so basically anti-industrialism. And they claim that there is a war being waged upon life. Atwa is a unified movement to redirect human efforts of war towards the problem. War on the problem, war on pollution, not war on life. And the thing about extremist groups is that there's always a kernel of rationality. And it's meant to lull you in to believe, oh, well, they're not so bad. And then, of course, you get further into the ideology, and because, well, that one thing wasn't so bad, oh, maybe they have a point. Or they definitely have a point. And then you kind of get sucked into extremism.
I think also, it's like the overpopulation thing.
Yeah.
Like it makes intuitive sense. We got too many people, not enough resources. We got to have fewer people, etc. And yeah, it is clear that nature's balance does not allow for one species to be so goddamn plentiful on the planet, especially when they are producing so much more waste than is natural and consuming so much more resources than is natural. But that doesn't that concept has led people to use their biases and stuff to say, yes, we have too many people and it's those people that we need to have less of.
And that is a major tenet of Charles Manson's belief structure.
And I believe the shooter who was in New Zealand earlier this year actually identified as an eco-fascist.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And the thing about fascism is that it is not an ideology. People think it's an ideology. It's not. It is a pattern of political action that uses ideologies to justify extreme nationalism, extreme state control, and isolationism and genocide. And it doesn't matter what the justification ends up being. They're very opportunistic when it comes to fascism as a abstract concept is very opportunistic when it comes to what ideas it will use. And if it can use caring about the environment as a justification, then it will do that. But, as this says, you don't care about how I feel.
In a way, this sort of Manson tribute potentially leads into the next song, Science.
Yeah, it really hammers that whole point home.
Which is very anti-science. It's
at very least like a dethroning of science from its position as the ultimate arbiter of truth, which there should be no ultimate arbiters of truth. And I agree with the message in this song completely. I am very pro-science when science can be useful, but there are so many situations where science is useless. When people turn to science for things that science cannot do, we end up having like terrible problems. Science is being used right now to justify persecution of trans people.
Well, pseudoscience is.
Yeah, but the thing is, the average person can't tell the difference.
Right.
For the most part. And every pseudoscience depends on real science to legitimize itself.
Right.
Just like fascism uses other ideologies to legitimize itself. So there's pseudoscience that is being used to persecute trans people or people of color or people with disabilities. And one of the lines in this song that I really like, science fails to recognize the single most potent element of human existence. Letting the reins go to the unfolding is faith. And it repeats the word faith a lot. And letting the reins go to the unfolding is like, it's a letting go of control. And in my university classes on social sciences specifically, but it applies to all science, science is a means of control. It's explicitly so. It is used to explain, predict, and control things, phenomena, people, animals, plants, whatever. You figure out how the world works, you figure out how it will work under certain circumstances, and then you manipulate those circumstances to get certain results. That's what science is for. Whereas the most potent element of human existence is letting go of control. That's when we can actually do great things, is when we recognize the limits of our own control and let nature take over, basically.
Well, see, I'm not quite sold on that in the sense that I feel that this is an extremist answer to an extremist problem. That I feel that it's an oversimplification of it. They are blatantly saying that science has failed our world, science has failed our Mother Earth.
I believe that it has. I mean, and I think it's failed because it never had the ability to, nature was doing fine on its own before we came around, and science has enabled us to pollute. It has enabled us to spread across the entire world and raise entire rainforests that have been around for millennia. And we did it all in the hope that, science knows better than nature. And science will take care of us better than nature could.
But is the proper solution to eschew science completely and return to a natural order, which is what I feel that they are advocating here. They're advocating for a complete rejection of science in favor of nature. And that is not in human nature. We are, as a species, prone towards industrialization and innovation. To reject science completely is to reject what humans are.
I don't necessarily think that this is arguing for a complete rejection of science, though. Because it doesn't say, it says science has failed, but failure doesn't mean rejection. Otherwise, there would be no point in me, because I've failed way too many times, you know? Yeah. I think it's about, recognizing the limitations. And all things have limitations. Right. So, I don't know. I think that might be something you and I disagree on. Yeah. But we can disagree, right?
Right.
And I think it's not that I disagree with your ideas about the world. It's that I disagree with your ideas about what this song is saying.
Right.
I think at heart we both agree. It's just that you're seeing things in this song that I don't see there that is making you object to its message.
Right.
Listeners, go ahead and make your own decision about this song.
Which is what the artist usually intends anyway.
Yeah.
So, the next song. Shimmy. I see it as sort of a song about conformity.
Yeah. Don't be late for school again, boy. Don't be late for school again, girl.
And that, I think me, I want life. I think me, I want a house and a wife. I want to shimmy, shimmy, shimmy through the break of dawn. Yeah. It sounds like your basic, simple pop song. It's like, I want love,
But then it goes indoctrination of a nation.
Which, of course,
subjugation of damnation, subjugation of damnation.
Which is something that pop music has been accused of doing.
Yeah.
So I think this might, also given the climate of the so-called TRL wars, I can certainly read that sort of anti-popularized music of the time. But again, it's, indoctrination of a nation. This could be, the education system. This could be the... another brick in a wall of this generation,
I don't think it's popular enough for that, though. I think that...
But it's in that vein of at least the message. Or it could be.
But I think it lays well into the next one.
The other big radio hit, Toxicity.
The album title song. Title track? Title track. It's also very similar to Chop Suey in that it weaves together these political and spiritual ideas. But we have eating seeds as a pastime activity. And I'm like, what kind of seeds are we talking about here? Are we talking about poppy seeds? Are we talking about opium?
We could be. They're good with symbolism like that.
Yeah.
Where it's like, it's there, it's obvious if you're looking for it.
So, somewhere between the sacred silence and sleep, disorder.
Well,
disorder.
Now what? Do you own the world? How do you own disorder?
And then we go back to that whole concept of control. Because, we can't own what we can't control. That's what ownership means. Mm-hmm. I think it kind of echoes the sentiment in, revolutionary politics that is become ungovernable. Mm-hmm. That is, you refuse to be controlled by the laws or the structures of the land. You just refuse to respond to the incentives and the sanction, and that drives people crazy. and that means that refusing to be punished as well as refusing to be rewarded, because it's like, if someone doesn't care if they get killed or imprisoned, they can do anything basically. Mm-hmm. You would have to, the only way to stop them would be to kill them,
right? And the album itself has basically been leading into Toxicity from Atwa on.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to really talk about Toxicity without considering the tracks that came before it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like those were like the lead-in to Toxicity.
Yeah. Looking at life through the eyes of a tire hub. That always really... Because it's like, okay, what is looking at life through the eyes of a tire hub? It means everything is spinning.
Right.
You're spinning, but it looks like the whole world is spinning.
Right.
And that's, I think, another very powerful image in that song.
So somewhere between the sacred silence and sleep. On a casual listen, I felt like that meant your piece is in between the sacred silence and sleep. The sort of intangible, where your balance, so to speak. But then it's followed by disorder.
There's shades of that in Aerials, and we'll talk about that later, but that one's coming up.
But it's like you're trying to find your balance, but you're surrounded by disorder.
Or, maybe the disorder is the balance. Because it's what does the system want? The, capitalistic, patriarchal, white supremacist superstructure that is society as we know it. It wants to separate things out into, categories. And it wants to have everybody doing predictable things on predictable patterns. It wants everybody to be in their place and to know their place and to stay in it. And... disorder is everything that isn't that. And that's where we find peace, is in not allowing these structures to define us.
Okay. So we have these really heavy songs followed by Psycho.
Psycho, groupie, cocaine, crazy.
Which is basically the entire song.
Makes you high, makes you really want to go. Stop!
Yeah.
Psycho, groupie, coke, gone crazy. Psycho, groupie, coke, makes you high, makes you really want to go.
Oh! So you want to see the show, you really don't have to be a hoe from the time you were a psycho, groupie, cocaine crazy. I'm feeling that on the surface this song is very obviously about groupies.
Yeah, but it's
But there has to be more to it because it's System of a Down.
Yeah, well, it might be like them like imparting a message to their fans. Listen, we don't want you to destroy yourselves just to like get closer to us.
Right.
We want you to be healthy and happy. We want you to be like part of our community, and we won't like demand that you be sexually available or anything like that just to get close to us.
And that would be more in fitting with the type of band that System of a Down is.
Yeah.
They seem far more interested in community and communing with fans rather than, just the party.
Yeah.
Not to say that they don't enjoy a good time. It's just that's not the purpose of the band. The band is to create community.
Anybody who is in a line of work where superstardom is a possibility.
I.e. not us.
Not us. Well, I mean, you never know. I mean, podcasters these days.
There's only millions of them.
Yeah.
Anyway, you were saying?
We have this attitude in our society, and it comes from individualism, which is, I think, in many ways a toxic ideology when it's taken too far. And that is the idea that, like, any behavior that a person displays comes from them, not from the position they're in. And so therefore, when we look at poor people who are drug addicted or sex workers or like criminals, that's because they have those traits and not because they are in a society that forces them to display those behaviors to survive or thrive.
Right.
And the same is true for rich people, because we see rich people being greedy, heartless, sociopathic, doing everything they can to get ahead, not caring or relating to the people who look up to them. And we think, gee, if I ever hit it big, I wouldn't be like that.
Except you probably will.
Yeah, because we don't realize that it's not the person, it's the position. Mm-hmm. I really love this one research study that was done a few years ago, where they had people come in and they had them play Monopoly. Mm-hmm. And as if Monopoly wasn't already
a painful game.
Yeah. They rigged the game so that one player at each table started with more money. And in addition, they had certain rules not apply to them. I think, for instance, they would not go to jail, for instance, if they hit on the go to jail space, or something to that effect. Right. So they had this combination of systemic favor and more resources. And of course, they would win, because it was easier for them to win. The game was rigged in their favor. And what they observed was that these people who were randomly assigned to have this advantage, they would play more, like, aggressively. They would be a whole lot more, like, cheerful when they, like, bankrupted another player. And all the other players were, like, would, like, totally resent this other player, because it was like, I got the shit end of the deal, and this person clearly has an unfair advantage. And then, after the game was over, they would ask each player why they thought they won if they won, and why they thought they lost if they lost. And the people who lost, they would be like, well, I lost because the game is rigged. And the person who won would be like, I won because I used this strategy, and I had this skill, and I made this good decision, and this play really, really helped me a lot. They would never say that they won because they had an advantage.
If you want an idea of how late-stage capitalism works, play Monopoly.
Yeah.
And this game was made around the time of the Great Depression.
It was initially invented as a criticism of capitalism.
Yes. And in leading into the Depression. So what that means, we have learned absolutely nothing.
Well, some of us have learned a bit, but unfortunately...
As a society, we have learned absolutely nothing.
Yeah. So if you're in a line of work where superstardom is a possibility, or if you are in a career where you might actually become wealthier than you are now. Don't fool yourself into believing that you are magically exempt from this known pattern. And you can use this as like evidence that, no, I'm not completely anti-science.
Right.
Because science can show us these patterns.
I don't necessarily think that you're anti-science.
No, there are
just
people
to make
who
that
are.
clear.
Yeah. And then we go into Aerials, which is the last track, but it's not the last song because there's a hidden extra track.
So Aerials seems to be one of those gaining enlightenment kind of songs.
Well, more than that, it's like if you are familiar with System of a Down, you may know that like they have all these songs that have like screamy bits and hard, like heavy metal-y bits, but they usually have one song that is much quieter and more melodic and less screechy. And Aerials is that one for this album, and it's about. Well, it says, life is a waterfall. We're one in the river and one again after the fall. And I believe when I was talking about toxicity, I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about the disorder between the sacred silence and sleep. Because we're one in the river, and then there's the waterfall. And the waterfall is chaotic because it's rushing and it's fast movement, and it's like all this unified mass of water is separated into millions of tiny little droplets. And then they hit the bottom and they are unified again into this one body of water at the bottom. And it really drives home that like this life we're in, where everybody is separate, we are separated from full understanding of each other and the world around us, is temporary.
So, and we are the ones that want to choose, always want to play, but you never want to lose.
Yeah, back to playing Monopoly, I guess.
I guess. But I also feel like that's like just pointing out the limitations that we place on ourselves.
Yeah, and also like shortly after that, when you lose small mind, you free your life. That is like when you're like your small mind is the mind that you think of as like just being yourself, separate from the rest of the world. But when you realize that you're connected to everything else, that's when you are free to be everything.
Right. And I feel like that's like part of my transition process.
Yeah.
Is that I have, for a very long time, not felt that there was a lot of value in spirituality. And that comes from being burned by organized religion for so long. And I'm now coming to a place where it's like, I don't know if I would call myself spiritual. I don't know if I would call myself anything like that, but I am seeking enlightenment and something beyond just what is measurable.
Yeah.
However, I do find a value in things being measured, as we discussed with the magic bar.
Yes.
There's a health bar, there's a magic bar, but I think in a very literal sense, we have like a stamina bar. Some people call it spoons.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And spoon theory, in case you don't know, was coined in the disability community.
Yes.
And spoons are a unit of measurement for measuring the amount of ability you have to do a certain thing. So you might say that taking a shower takes a certain amount of spoons. Making yourself a meal takes a certain amount of spoons. And these are things that most people who aren't experiencing disabilities, they don't think of these as actions that deplete your resources because they just get up and do it without even really thinking about it. But if you're dealing with something like chronic fatigue or mobility problems or like depression that limit the motivation to act, these take a lot more out of you.
And it also applies to people who are neurodivergent.
Yes, because things that, for instance, like if you are on the autism spectrum and you have a certain sensory sensitivity. I once got into an argument with my mother because she didn't want me to wear a certain thing on a job interview. And I was like, well, I need to wear these shoes, even though they are casual shoes and they're not appropriate for a job interview, because otherwise I will be so uncomfortable, I won't be able to perform well at the job interview.
Right.
And she thought that was just unacceptable and I should just put up with it and suck it up. And the fact is, it's not possible. I can either perform well at this job interview or I can put up with wearing uncomfortable shoes. I cannot do both.
And this is one of those things that neurotypicals do not understand.
Yes.
Kind of go again back to the magic bar, the health bar, and whatnot. You have a certain amount of, I call it emotional energy. It takes a certain amount, socialization takes X amount of energy. Doing basic household stuff takes a certain amount of energy. Just going outside of my apartment takes a certain level of energy.
I think recording this podcast takes energy for both of us. It's something that we both value doing, and I think it's enriching both our lives. But I get home after one of these recording sessions, and I'm like, I'm done. I can't do anything more because I talked for 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
And that just takes it out of me.
You're not alone in that. I mean, after one of these, it is basically, okay, what's on TV? Oh, wait, I don't actually have TV. What's on YouTube?
And then you have to decide what YouTube video to watch, and that's a chore.
Well, I find that it's easier than interacting with human beings. So.
Oh, yes.
But...
thank God for parasocial relationships.
The thing is that self-care is important.
Yeah.
And I feel that spiritual self-care is important too. And that's what I think that's the point I was trying to make about the magic bar and the need to, the quantification of magic, because you're only going to be able to handle so much at one time.
And that goes back to what we were talking about evangelism, because there's a certain strain of religiosity that it exists in Christianity, but it also exists in almost every other organized religion. And that is the mentality that the leaders of the faith are the people who own your spiritual life. They are the ones who hold all the cards. They're the ones who dole out indulgences if you need forgiveness. They're the ones who interpret the sacred text for you.
Right.
Whereas I think the more accurate view of spirituality is that we primarily do those things for ourselves, and we rely on one another when we ourselves fail. And not failing in the sense that it's a personal failing, but that we are meant to depend on one another for all things. So when I'm dealing with a serious spiritual problem, like for instance, like the spiritual crisis that I went through early on in my transition, where I was like, what am I doing here? What is the meaning of me doing this in my spiritual understanding of the world and myself? And I had to use a combination of meditating on these questions by myself and also talking to other people who are both spiritual and trans about their experiences, because it's just we need to be discussing these really weighty matters, no matter who you are, whether you consider yourself a religious person or not. You have spiritual needs. Everybody has a different level of spiritual need, but I do believe we all have spiritual needs.
When you lose your small mind, you free your life. When you free your eyes, eternal prize. The reaching of nirvana, so to speak. Not the band, the actual, the spiritual blah thing.
Yeah.
The place that Kurt Cobain would have preferred to be.
Yeah, well, he might be there now.
Well, when he named the band, he probably wanted to be there, get me the hell out of this
endless cycle of rebirth. Do we want to move into the bonus track? So it's pretty short. It's about 2 minutes long, and it begins with a flute solo. And then there's percussion and what sounds like nonverbal chanting, and using their voices to imitate birds, and it's got this very wilderness type feel to it, very primitivist kind of. It's with drums and flute and entirely nonverbal. It's just bird calls and nonverbal utterances that just reach into some kind of primal nature, and so it really fits thematically with a lot of the songs that are sort of reaching back to that primitive state.
It sounded very native, but of course native to where?
Yeah,
because
I think that's kind of intentional. It's not specifically evoking any specific culture, just this vague feeling of primitiveness that's
Well, I feel too that a lot of music of native peoples share similarities.
Yeah.
They are often very percussion based.
Yeah, because percussion instruments are the easiest to make.
Yes.
And they're the easiest to make with objects you might find in nature.
Mm-hmm.
There's the Red Hot Chili Peppers made a song where one of the lines is, "Music, the great communicator, use 2 sticks to make it in the nature." It's like, yes, you can take 2 sticks and bang them together, make music.
Well, along with the ease of being able to find, create, or just have percussion, there's also a lot of, as you were putting it, non-verbal vocal.
Yes.
And in a sense, music likely predated language as we know it.
There's a lot of evidence that music originated from primitive hominids either making tools together or in some way working together, and it's easier to do that kind of labor if you build up a rhythm, and it's easier to stay in rhythm if you're establishing a rhythm in unison with other people. That's why American slaves back in the day would sing songs together while they're working out in the field, because it helps them work. And then those songs turned into vital communicators of meaning and messages. There's evidence that some of the songs that they were singing out in the fields contained hidden messages on how to escape. Or how to subvert their oppression in some way. So it really gets at the meaning of music in the beginning. It's music isn't about I think that as poets and writers, you and I tend to focus a lot on the words when we're talking about music. But I think it's helpful to remember that music is essentially a nonverbal form of communication. Yeah. The words add to the meaning. They are not the meaning.
Right. This is a good way for an album that starts off decrying prison industrialism, and makes some really sharp political points, and evolves into a spiritual awakening, and that this is this is the connection to nature. Or at least that's the impression I'm getting from the hidden track.
Yep, just the fact that it's hidden, I think, plays into that, because it's if you give that song a name and a number, it's you're taking away from its message, which is we can't reduce these messages to a name and a number on track listing. And the fact that it is a bonus track that is available to people who own the CD or something, it's a reminder of the physicality. And the fact that hidden tracks started in the 90s and the early 2000s, as the last track on the album went on a little bit longer and had a second song in it, that doesn't translate well to the more modern way of consuming music through MP3s or streaming, because it's songs are supposed to be these discrete units that can be shuffled around, but this requires that you listen to the album as a single thing that is physically linked together. And it's a callback to an earlier time in it's at this point it's double nostalgic, because this song is a callback to a more primitive era, and now its existence is a callback to an era of recording music that existed for a couple of years, a couple decades ago.
And it's also sort of a relic of the music industry before the bottom dropped out.
Yeah.
Because MP3s and digital streaming changed the way people consume music. And did so drastically.
Completely. It's and this has been in our lifetimes. I think it's possibly as revolutionary as the advent of recording itself. Because it used to be you could have a recording, but you could only have one of them. Or maybe if you had the right equipment, you could make one copy. Whereas now it's you can make infinite copies with very, very little resources.
The industry has not recovered from MP3. They have not known how to mitigate that, and the record industry in general has been losing money, or at least not having the record profits they had in the late 90s when it sort of topped out.
Yeah, whereas the individual independent artists have experienced a renaissance.
Oh, yeah.
Because you don't need to sign with a record label to have the resources to produce and distribute music anymore.
Yeah, it's the democratization of media.
Exactly. Like we've been talking about since the beginning.
But it also has led to the major record companies doing something known as a 360 deal. Mm-hmm. They don't just own the rights to your song or your music. They own a piece of your touring. They own a piece of your merchandising. They own a piece of whatever else you're doing.
Yeah.
So you're now even more beholden to the major record companies if you want to get that major distribution. So, nowadays it makes more sense to just bet on yourself. But of course, betting on yourself comes with the risk of not being seen.
Yeah, but I think that's also like you're giving up some control. And ironically, by giving up control, you end up being more free.
And System of a Down does not necessarily leave a lot of room for... They know what they want to tell you. Mm-hmm. It may not necessarily come across... in one particular, the Jet Pilot is a good example of. They clearly had something to say, but
maybe
don't know what it was.
They might have had something to say, or they might not have, but who knows?
But everything else on here, it's like the first song you get into is like, okay, there's no death of the author here at all.
Anyway,
yeah,
good album. I like it.
Yeah, it was cool.
You should listen to it. It holds up.
Yes, it is definitely one of the albums of the TRL war era that was good, and you shouldn't feel ashamed of if you had.
This has been False Dichotomies. I'm Cy Castells.
I'm Daria Quinn, and thank you for spending your time with us. Yeah, we probably want to cut that part too.
Small for a cis guy.
Well, yeah, but you're not a... Okay, yeah, we're cutting this too.